Hello. So today I would like to. Well, this is the third one in what I've called the sort of modular fundamentals. And of course, it's not really just about modular, it's about, well, music in general, but it's also very much about electronic sound. And I wanted to think today about what kind of sounds do we make using modular synthesizers or other synthesizers. What kind of sounds do we make, and to some extent, why are these interesting? Electronic sounds in music start pretty much with test equipment, equipment that's made for laboratory sounds. Also, a lot of equipment that had military purposes or very much to do with radio, sending, receiving, coding radio signals, and also narrowing down frequency ranges and dynamic ranges so that signals could be broadcast or could be squeezed onto record and tape and so forth. So most of the familiar early instruments come from these sources. There were other instruments, of course, like the theremin, that were more specialist electronic instruments from the start, but we'll give those their own category. There's a boat passing outside. I don't know if you can hear it or not. I hope it's not interfering. I won't know until I listen back to the recording later. So I've got some basic categories, which I'll go through the categories first. I feel slightly organized with this. The first is pure electronic sound. The second is synthesized sounds, which has a subcategory of instrumental sounds. And then modeled sounds. And then what I'm calling tangible sounds. So I'll go through these and see where it takes us. So pure electronic sounds, as I say, these electronic laboratory kind of sounds. And by this we're talking about quite pure sounds like pure sine waves or square waves. Also ring modulation and frequency shifting. And these tools typically sound quite unfamiliar, or they did sound unfamiliar in the 1950s, for example, when composers like Imert and Stockhausen were using them, and Koenig in the Cologne studios, and at least part of Stockhausen's aim in this was to make sounds that did escape from history, and that not only escaped the history of Germany or history of Europe or the history of European music, but gave perhaps a new space to think, a new space to experience the world. And these sounds were almost shocking in a way, or at least unfamiliar. And I don't know how important it was for them to be shocking for Stockhausen, perhaps not so much. But I think the important thing is that they opened the ear to something wider than instrumental music. They opened the ear to a whole world of sound. And although, well, this is my take on this is that these kind of sounds were understood very strongly as abstract, also seen in connection with abstract art, abstract painting. But my feeling is that that's a bit of a misnomer, partly because many of these sounds, although they might not exist in nature in very pure ways, in the way they do in electronics, that something like a sine wave or pure noise or square waves, of course they have a lot of parallels in nature, especially if you get into field recording or close miking. You hear all kinds of sounds in nature that are very much associable with electronic music. So my feeling is that by opening the world to abstract electronic sounds, you're opening your ear also to nature, because electricity is nature. Like, we're nature. Electrical components, all this stuff is made from nature, and it's not so. As soon as you turn on electricity, you're not suddenly living in a different universe. It So my feeling is that these early electronics, especially, were really opening the ears, opening the perspectives. And to add to that, I don't think abstract art is abstract. I think abstract expressionism is a bit of a misnomer. And artists like Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner and Willem de Kooning and Joan Mitchell, I'm very keen on. They are, like, if you sit in front of some of these pictures, like some of Pollock's best work in a gallery, this experience is not cold, abstract, scientific, or removed from the human experience. Quite the opposite. He's kicking art out of the way in order to grab your eye, in order to grab your body, in order to... It's very physical, it's very natural. The only abstraction is that he's not portraying the human form, but he is portraying the human experience, and all of these artists were. So it was never abstract to begin with. But yeah, I'm going off on a tangent there. Let's come back. So the next category I'd like to talk about is synthesized sounds. And what I mean by synthesized sound is sounds that are very clearly made by what became known as synthesizers. And we can include a lot of different sounds in this, all of which were quite unfamiliar in the beginning. I remember hearing Moroder and Donna Summers, I Feel Love for the first time in the 70s, and I nearly felt like throwing up hearing this on the radio. It was just as shocking as Stockhausen. Sonically, it was really strange sound. I never heard this kind of thing before, this mood modular sequencing. It was very alien, very astonishing experience. But now you hear this nostalgic almost. But I don't want to reduce synthesizer sounds to nostalgia, but this is a big part of what has happened in the last 20 years. But I think what defines synthesized sounds is they're kind of made by a synthesizer rather than randomly patched electronics. And normally those synthesizers are quite organized in terms of signal flow. And generally they've got an interface, whether it's a sequencer or a keyboard. So I'm talking about sounds, for example, bass lines on Stevie Wonder albums, Morton Subotnick. Some of his sounds are very clearly a synthesizer. They're an electronic universe. Also, groups like Japan, Human League, and of course Kraftwerk, kind of brought together these electronic sounds that became definitive of eras, but also instruments. And people love these sounds. People love the characteristic sounds of blah blah, this and that, Moog filter or Korg filter, or to me it's not that interesting. And the bit that particularly isn't interesting is that, although, like, at the time I had a Korg Ms-20 because it's what was around, and I can't say this is a great synthesizer. I know people love it, and that's totally cool to get something from that, or if that's but it's a very limited instrument, and most of these analog instruments from the 70s and 80s were very limited, and they're limited in terms of using subtractive synthesis, not having a huge amount of timbral possibility, and also, well, really limited in terms of the envelope shaping, because the envelope shaping, which is the how the sound changes over time, these early analog envelopes are pretty primitive and often weren't really modulatable, and so every time you hit the key it's going boing, boing, and it goes higher or lower, but it's still basically going boing, and there might be some kind of variation, but that is advertising the behavior of this sound is not a natural phenomenon. it's been extremely controlled, and it's been extremely controlled with quite narrow parameters. And people come to love that. Yeah, so there's a nostalgic aspect to these synthesized sounds, but originally they were much weirder. They were much more surprising, and they're much more shocking. And now we recognize them as being friendly and familiar. So they become a sort of category that we recognize with our ears in quite a different way from these pure electronic sounds. We also, if we know anything about musical history, we already recognize these pure electronic sounds, and they're on our phones, they're on buzzers, they're on doorbells, they're all over the place. But there's still something a little eerie and a little unfamiliar and not part of our everyday existence. Whereas I think the sound of a synthesizer being played is really part of the culture now. You can't claim that's strange or unusual. And part of that comes from the limitations of the original instruments, which you either celebrate or are quickly bored by. In my case, I don't care about synthesizers as such. I have one synthesizer, Oberheim Matrix, and I really like that. But I like that because of its modulation possibilities. It's closer to a modular synthesizer. So synthesizer sounds, okay, lead us to the next one, which is almost a subset of synthesizer sounds. And it's also a bridge between where we're going. This is instrumental sounds, but not real instrumental sounds. And my model for this is the Korg Ms-20. With the manual was a patch book, which is a set of suggested patches to get you started. And I've discussed this before. I hope I'm not repeating myself too much, but this had sounds like clarinet, cello, trumpet, and a bunch of other instrumental sounds. And the patches were mostly bad. Like, they didn't really sound anything like these things, or they sounded maybe 2% like them. And all you had was a wheel and a keyboard. So it was a little bit crappy. But it was also misleading because for like a young kid like me, I didn't know anything about electronics or synthesizers. I couldn't really understand the manual. Like, what's a voltage control amplifier, or and this thing that doesn't amplify, it makes things quieter. So it was kind of confusing. And then you'd patch the patch book up, and then really nothing happening. But of course the thing was a semi-modular. It had a patch bay. You could patch all the stuff up, and some of it made sense, some of it didn't, and you could create all these atmospheric sounds like water dripping, or this is like ambient, more soundscapey things. And for me, I got this sort of more natural sound out of it. But and the other edge of the world, and also the other edge of synthesizer skills at that time, was to meter, making extraordinary electronic versions of classical music. And although musically this doesn't have any interest for me at all, in terms of sound design, in terms of arrangement, and in terms of sheer artistic commitment, these Tomita records are amazing. I really recommend listening to them. He took it farther than anyone at that time, using an instrument that you basically early Moog modular. You could hardly play it in tune. And he made these extraordinary kind of quasi chamber music, quasi orchestral realizations of this music. So that showed that the early claims about synthesizers, which were not, this is the weirdest sound on earth, let's get into it, but the opposite, the synthesizer can copy any instrument, Tomita almost showed it to be true. But for most of us mere mortals, that wasn't really true. But more than that, what was interesting about the synthesizer was the fact that it didn't sound like any other instrument. It seemed like almost accidentally this instrument that was supposed to copy other sounds and was supposed to make all other instruments obsolete, actually created its own aesthetic, but also its own kind of world of sounds, this library of sonic possibilities, which in terms of analog synthesis is still unfolding now. The analog synthesis, I've said this so many times, but analog synthesis doesn't belong to the 60s or 70s. The golden age of analog synthesis is now, because we have so much technology and so much access to technology. And I think one reason musicians went back to, even the term is like, in a way it's ideological, like we're supposed to progress, we're supposed to move forward. Well, musicians didn't. They looked back at these instruments, and a lot of musicians felt, well, actually these analog instruments were the future and are the future, and we collectively had barely begun to explore them before they were all replaced with digital instruments, digital interfaces, memories. And a lot of that was about this instrumental approach, that actually the digital approach, especially if you combine synthesis with sampling, is much, much more efficient than analog ever was. And most people that were working with analog synthesizers in the early 70s abandoned them through the 70s and 80s, either to use digital synthesizers or to use computers. Like academic composition moved completely over to computers. So these instruments that still seem so amazing and full of potential to us today didn't seem, well, they were obsolete, basically. Before the end of the 80s, this stuff was obsolete. The industry wasn't interested. So it's people that were interested. And one reason that analog synthesis came back is not because of the ability of a synthesizer to copy an acoustic sound, but with this other ability, its ability to sound like itself, or its ability to make a sound that you'd never heard before, and to be able to try and do something musical with that. So here things split off into synthesis, what I would call, I don't even want to say true synthesis, that's not the kind of language I use, but there's some kind of split between more analog-based synthesis and modeling synthesis. So the to-meter approach led to some interesting instruments, such as the Yamaha VL series, and also some software-based instruments such as Native Instruments Absinthe, which had very interesting physical modeling possibilities, and the Nord modulars. So these instruments enabled you to model using carpless or different kinds of bandpass filtering. They enabled you to model tubes and strings and make really quite interesting clones, interpretations of acoustic instruments. Of course, they also enabled you to make acoustic instruments that couldn't exist, because it's based on the principles of these instruments, not on sampling them, but on recreating part of their structure, the sound, the way they resonate, the way sound travels, the way it's amplified, the way some frequencies are amplified more than others in an acoustic instrument. So this is the next category. I'm talking about modeled sounds. So we've got this range of categories, and the beauty of all of this is that you don't have to choose. And what I'm interested in, which reflects, and my conceptualization of this comes from, apart from using the instruments, but also from conversations with Rob Hordyke and with Trevor Wishart, is, I'm calling it tangible, and I think this is the word that Rob uses, but there's other ideas. You could also say plausible or feasible. So Rob Hordyke says that this instrument was designed around the idea of tangible sounds. So this is pure electronic sounds. These are sounds that absolutely exist in the pure electronic domain and are not trying to escape from that. They're not trying to recreate something else. But they're taking cues from how acoustic instruments work, from how the air might filter some sounds. You know, the further away a sound gets, the more moisture there is in the air, and the more that masks high frequencies. That's my understanding of it. Maybe some scientists out there can correct that, but that's my understanding of it. So electronic instruments can duplicate this kind of phenomena, but it's not so much like the early synthesizers. It's not so much that they do it badly, but they translate it into a electronic into an electronic domain. And I think that's also why I see what I do musically as electroacoustic. Even if there's no acoustic instruments directly involved, I'm always dealing with a sort of electroacoustic aesthetic. And part of that is because this idea of feasibility, I think, serves two purposes. So let me try and talk about these two purposes. I haven't actually done this before. But one purpose is that they are producing something from the idea of synthesized sounds, or the idea of instrumental sounds, or the idea of modeled sounds. They're including some cues from that. And one example of that is like the Buchla low pass gate, or the Surge resonant Q filter, or the Hordijk twin peak filter. All of these have a sort of percussive ping. They're all reproducing something about the way that a percussive sound occurs, whether you're plucking a string, there's a particular kind of attack, there's a particular kind of decay, there's a particular kind of resonance, or the famous Buchla bongo, or the Buchla banjo. But all of these sounds have this percussive character, and it mirrors something that we know about musical instruments without directly copying it. So there's something fascinating about that world of, here's a world that relates to our awareness and our experience of physical sounds, of sounds in the universe, of sounds in the world, of how we receive sounds with our bodies. But it's also in a domain that's somewhat abstracted from that, that's somewhat by the side, that's projected through loudspeakers. Of course it's an artificial world to some extent, but it's, as I said before, it's still nature, it's still electricity, but of course in a very different, controlled and understood and projected and received in a very different way, from sitting in a forest and listening to the wind move the trees, and that might be a very similar sound, and part of us hearing an electronic version of that knows that it's a very similar sound, but we also know that it isn't a natural sound, that there's something artificial. So this idea of tangibility in electronic sound, I think, is always playing with both of these ideas. But that makes it sound like what I'm interested in is only what I know. Well, humans, musical language, of course, we're very biased towards what we know. But why would you dedicate your life to electronic music, or why would you or to instruments like this that are constantly delivering things that you don't know? Well, and I think this is the other side. There's a kind of so this idea of tangibility, on the one side, it has a kind of contains a kind of predictability, a kind of familiarity. But on the other side, it's the opposite. tangibility gives us a way into understanding electronic sounds, not that only mimic the behavior of the physics and biology and sense of gravity that we know in our lives, in our bodies, on this planet, but sounds that could feasibly exist in other contexts, sounds that might suggest slightly different biologies, that might be from animals that we don't know, that might exist or might not exist, or senses of gravity, senses of movement. Why does a sound rise? Is it somehow being blown by the wind, or what forces make sounds move in space? And this is a much more imaginative possibility, because it is possible to make electronic sounds where the behavior is not something we recognize, but somehow we can still interpret it or experience it, or there's some familiarity there. And I think this connects us right back to the idea of pure electronic sounds, that even in these very pure sounds there's some sense of familiarity, even if the whole context is unfamiliar. So I'm not trying to say that we should be dealing with only the unfamiliar, or we should be ignoring the familiar. I think the familiar is inside the unfamiliar, and the unfamiliar is inside the familiar. At least in the kind of electronic music that I personally find interesting. I'm always trying to emphasize that with these talks I'm really talking about my interest in this and my world with this and my engagement with this, and I have to accept that it can be very, very different for other people. So where do we go with this idea? I think in composition, the sense of tangibility is something that I rely on a lot to give a sense of cause and effect. So this sound happens, and this is the consequence. Or a series of loud sounds happen, and then there might be a quieter section that's almost a kind of recovery. So this I think this is very familiar from musique concrète, from acousmatic music, that there's this kind of emulation of events that we embody by listening to them. And this relates very much to an idea from Dennis Smalley that is ultimately derived, I think, from Schaeffer. I don't want to go hugely into this today, but the base idea from Schaeffer of reduced listening is that you strip away, by recording a sound and presenting it as a recording, you strip away all the familiarity of this sound. You're able to treat it as a genuinely abstract object that you've abstracted from its context by recording it. You can also treat sounds, say take off the beginning or loop them, for example, and then that's a further abstraction. So you're then able to hear these sounds as pure sounds. But of course this is a huge oversimplification, and Schaeffer that wasn't really his argument, because he's very aware that you never lose the implications of the sounds, that some implications are going to stay. Dennis Smalley's idea of spectromorphology is less, I would say, about reduced listening, but is more about this question that I'm dealing with now of feasibility. That when you listen to an abstract electronic sound, you see, you envision, you imagine something rising, or one sound interrupting another, or a sound dropping, and even if these sounds are completely new, completely strange to us, we know how gravity works. We know that when you drop something it falls, perhaps it bounces. We know that when you throw something it has a certain trajectory. We know that when the wind blows in our face, it moves our hair back. We know that a sound that is this close is going to sound very different from if the same sound is 50 meters back or even 3 meters back. So we have an innate sense of how sounds and space and motion work, and our way of listening to music is very much built on that, and especially when you get away from instrumental music, you open up these other doors. So this, I personally find this spectromorphological idea very useful in understanding what's going on, because it's a kind of embodiment that as we listen, we embody the sounds, we hear something like an impact, and we know what that would be on our body. In the same way, if you see like a car accident or some violent incident, I mean, you might have a strong psychological reaction to it, but you also have a very strong physical aspect to it, that as if it's happening to you. And we also see this with dance performances. How can anybody watch a dance performance? What's happening when we watch a dance performance? Well, one thing that's happening is, even though we probably can't do the same movements the dancers make, we have bodies. So we, in terms of shared human experience, historical human experience, but also very practical, immediate human experience, we know what it feels like to jump. We know what it feels like to land. We know what it feels like to be still. We know what it feels like to relax. So I think spectromorphology is a very, very similar idea to this. And what I like about it is, if we start with, abstract buzzing sound in a laboratory, this can still take us reasonably directly to a sense of embodiment, to a sense of us listening to sounds in space, or listening to sounds using our bodies and through our bodies. And this, for me, this idea of tangibility really brings this together, that I'm interested in sounds that could exist. And that's a bit different from being interested in sounds that you've never heard before, or in sounds that imitate acoustic instruments or imitate physical events. I think this idea of tangibility gives a lot of freedom and gives a lot of play. I mean, there's a lot you could say about it. You can criticize this idea, but at least in terms of my aesthetic, how I think about the instruments and how I use them, I find it very useful. I've suggested ways in which it might be useful to build compositions, and I'd say, if you think about phrasing, if you think about call and response, if you think about dynamics, if you think about an innate sense of gravity in sound, then the idea that sounds are tangible or feasible is very valuable. But what I particularly find it useful for is improvisation, and I'm mostly working with groups or with acoustic instrumentalists. Not entirely, but mostly. And I find that electronic sounds that sound like a synthesizer, that sound like a Mini Moog, that sound like a Roland or Korg or whatever it is, are in a particular band in terms of the dynamics, but also in terms of the signature, the timbre, and it's hard for them to move out of that. They tend to be in a particular position in the mix. That's also why I gave up the soprano saxophone. Actually, I felt that it was always in the same place. Of course, you can move it around, but I wanted to play an instrument that could go beneath the bass, or by the sides, or way above the other instruments, that part of playing a synthesizer is choosing your register. You, of course, especially with solo work, can be valuable to coexist in several different registers at the same time and create a kind of conversation between them. But in terms of improvising with acoustic instruments, it's to be able to move around, to have the same kind of freedom and flexibility and dynamics of many acoustic instruments is very desirable, and some kind of tangibility of sound, of phrasing, of percussiveness, of texture means you can blend with other instruments in many cases, and you can change your position in relation to the other instruments. So I'm dealing with electronics, but I think always with something of a acoustic sensibility. And I've had two concerts which, to be honest, made me think I was getting somewhere, not because of what I played, but because I had two people come up to me after concerts. This is a few years ago already, and both of them said the same thing. Well, one of them said, "I think you were a saxophone player before you were working with electronics," and I was really astonished. This lady had a very specific perspective on what I was doing, and what I was doing this concert didn't sound anything like saxophone, but she kind of got the acoustic quality of it, and the acoustic flexibility of what I was trying to do. And then I had a very similar comment that was in Holland. The other comment was somewhere in Germany, I don't remember where, and again a woman came up and said, I was thinking about saxophone all the way through your concert. This brings up a lot of other issues about what we bring to electronics and what other musical experiences we bring to electronics and how useful they were. But for me, it helped me to clarify, my focus is on sounds that could exist, sounds that have a sense of cause and effect and consequence, rather than sounds that are just alien or coming from somewhere else. Although I really like to engage those sounds, I'm always looking for some kind of phrasing, for something that connects it. So I'm really not a... Sometimes people think I'm a noise artist, or... One of the great compliments I've also had at a gig is someone came up and said, "Oh, you're a fake noise artist. Like, you're trying to pass yourself off as being a noise artist, but actually you're a musician." And again, and sometimes what people hear in the audience is really amazing. And I thought that was very insightful, because if I am using noise or chaos or destructive, distorted sounds, I'm always trying to shape it. I'm always trying to take it somewhere that I feel is musical, or I feel has some narrative, or some song, some dance, some rhythm. So even in the most abstract areas, I think this idea of sounds having a certain tangibility is a very useful idea. I'd be very interested to get any feedback or questions you have on this. I've been really pleased. I've only been doing these things a few weeks, but I've been really pleased people started asking me questions, and I will try and respond to all of them within the confines that these talks have to be improvised and unprepared for me. Otherwise, not because I just wouldn't do them otherwise. If I was to sit down and write these as lectures, they'd be chores, and frankly you should pay me. But as it is with this, they have to be improvisations, but I try and bear in mind the feedback, and when I can, direct my comments towards it. I hope that's all right. I hope I don't appear arrogant today. having in the back of my mind that I might be, kind of talking about people's reactions to my concerts. I'm not a rock and roll star. I'm just a musician, but I performed with these instruments quite a lot, so that's why I have really trying to make the point that I've learned from audience reactions to my work. It's helped me to reflect on what it is I'm actually doing, what kind of sounds I'm interested in, and what kind of sounds I find musically useful. Thank you. As always, I hope that made sense.